A billionaire tycoon lies on the edge of collapse inside a mountain resort. The last person he expected to depend on is the very one he dismissed as insignificant. But fate has other plans, because she's about to save him, whether he realizes it or not. Evergreen Peak Resort, where $800 a night buys more than marble floors and glittering chandeliers. Here, silence is priceless, and hierarchy is sacred. Guests are treated like royalty. Staff, they're ghosts. Sophie Miller, 27, moves unnoticed through these hallways, pushing her cleaning cart like a shadow. To most, she's invisible, the girl who tidies rooms for people who earn in an hour what she makes in a month. On her uniform is a tiny worn pin that reads, "Nursing Student," a relic of a dream abandoned. She left school years ago, convinced she'd never be enough. Room 1247 belongs to Nathan Brooks, the software king whose medical empire once transformed hospitals. Now he's hiding from lawsuits and headlines, hoping the mountain air will shield him from the storm. To Nathan, Sophie is background noise. He commands, she obeys. He's important. She's not. But what Nathan doesn't know is that Sophie carries a different kind of knowledge. Lessons not from textbooks, but from her late mother, a nurse who died from an illness caught too late. Sophie dropped out the day after the funeral, believing she'd never measure up to the white coats who ignored her mother's warning signs. Yet every morning she still touches the old nursing manual she keeps in her cart, remembering her mother's words. "You don't need a title to save a life, sweetheart. You just need eyes that see and a heart that cares." One quiet morning, Sophie notices something alarming on Nathan's leg as she gathers towels. An unmistakable red circle with a pale center. The bullseye rash. The mark her mother once showed her in a textbook. Lyme disease. And judging from its stage, time is already running short. Her heart races. She knows exactly what she's looking at. But who would believe the word of a maid? In this world of power and credentials, she's nobody. And yet her mother's voice whispers back, "Sometimes being right is more important than being heard." Over the next 3 days, Sophie watches in silence as Nathan begins to unravel. His stride loses confidence. His sharp eyes turn dull with fatigue. Coffee cups scatter across the suite, forgotten mid-sip. His once flawless routine collapses into confusion and restless naps. The man who once commanded boardrooms now struggles to finish a sentence. And though she says nothing, Sophie memorizes every detail because she knows they matter. Then, on Thursday, the resort receives a visitor. Dr. Charles Grady, Nathan's longtime physician, arrives in a sleek black Mercedes that slices through the mountain mist. Silver-haired, commanding, every step in his polished shoes radiates authority. The kind of man no one dares question. Sophie recognizes the type instantly. The doctor who trusts charts more than instincts, who hears only what fits his conclusion. She watches him escorted upstairs like a VIP, the manager himself holding open doors with deference. Inside, Sophie lingers near the suite closet, cleaning quietly, when Dr. Grady's voice carries into the room. "Just stress, Nathan. Months of litigation would drain anyone. You need rest, perhaps a little exercise. Nothing serious." Nathan protests, mentions the joint pain, the lapses in thought. But the doctor waves it off, chalking it up to anxiety, exhaustion, psychosomatic. The word slams into Sophie's chest like a memory. She's heard it before, from the very doctors who dismissed her mother's cries for help. Her hands tighten on her cleaning supplies until her knuckles turn white. She's just the maid, invisible, silent. But she knows the truth no one else is willing to see, and now time is running out. Breath. Unnecessary. I can diagnose stress without subjecting you to a battery of expensive tests. Trust me, Nathan. I've been practicing medicine longer than that cleaning girl has been alive. The casual cruelty of that statement hits Sophie. like a physical blow. Dr. Grady didn't even know she existed yet. Somehow, he had made her irrelevant to a conversation about symptoms she had identified days ago. That evening, as she finished her rounds, Sophie found Nathan in the resort's library, slumped in a leather chair with a book unopened in his lap. The confident CEO had been replaced by someone fragile, someone fighting a battle he couldn't name, against an enemy he couldn't see. The library had become her refuge during difficult shifts, a quiet space where guests rarely ventured after dinner. She hadn't expected to find Nathan there looking so utterly defeated that her nurturing instincts overrode her survival instincts for the first time since their awkward encounter. He looked up when she entered the room. Not through her, not past her, but at her. Really at her. The change was so startling that she nearly dropped her cleaning supplies. "You're Sophie, right?" His voice was haryard in a way that sleep couldn't cure. Sophie Miller. She nodded, surprised he knew her name, surprised he was using it. In her 3 years at Evergreen, guests had called her Miss Yao there, or simply gestured in her direction. When they needed something. "I keep thinking about what you said, about the tick." He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly at the movement that shouldn't have caused pain. "Why did you notice it?" Sophie's throat went dry. This was dangerous territory. The space between her past and her present, between who she used to be and who she had been forced to become. "My mother was a nurse," this shy girl said quietly. "She taught me to pay attention to things that didn't belong." Was the question hung in the air like a challenge? Sophie could have deflected, changed the subject, retreated back into invisibility. Instead, something about Nathan's genuine curiosity made her answer honestly. "She died 5 years ago. Misdiagnosed pneumonia that was actually a rare autoimmune condition. By the time they figured it out, her organs were already shutting down." Sophie's voice caught slightly on the words she had never spoken aloud to a stranger. The attending physician said her symptoms were typical nursing hypochondria, that healthcare workers always think they're sicker than they are. Nathan leaned forward, his businessman's instincts, recognizing something valuable in her quiet honesty. "Is that why you left nursing school?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She had grown so used to being overlooked that having someone see her, really see her, felt both terrifying and strangely motivational. "I couldn't save her," she whispered. "What was the point of trying to save anyone else? But you still tried to save me." Sophie met his gaze for just a moment before looking away. Some habits die hard. Nathan studied her face with an intensity that made her want to disappear back into her comfortable invisibility. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was everything I'm not," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. "Confident, respected, trusted. She could walk into any room and people would listen to her. Maybe you're more like her than you think." The words hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Sophie felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing. The hope that maybe her voice did matter, that maybe her mother's lessons hadn't died with her. The next morning brought changes that couldn't be dismissed as stress. Nathan's left hand had developed a slight tremor that he tried to hide by keeping it in his pocket. His words occasionally slurred at the edges so subtly that anyone not paying close attention might miss it. But Sophie was always paying attention. She had learned from her mother that the devil lived in details, that life and death often hung on the things that seemed too small to matter. During her morning cleaning, she noticed new details that painted a troubling picture. Nathan's handwriting, once sharp and decisive, had become shaky and uncertain. She found pages of notes where he had started sentences and abandoned them mid-thought. His laptop showed multiple browser tabs open to medical websites, searches for joint pain, memory problems, unexplained fatigue. He was trying to diagnose himself. She realized the man who had dismissed her concerns was now desperately searching for answers that his expensive doctor refused to provide. Dr. Grady returned. That afternoon, his confidence, unned by the progression of symptoms that should have alarmed any competent physician. Sophie lingered in the hallway outside Nathan's suite, her cart positioned so she could hear their conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. "The tremor is stress-related," Dr. Grady pronounced with the authority of someone who had never been wrong. "Perhaps a mild anxiety disorder brought on by your legal troubles. I can prescribe something for that. Charles, I feel like my brain is wrapped in cotton. Yesterday I forgot my own phone number. This isn't stress. Nathan, you're a brilliant man, but you're not a doctor. Leave the diagnosis to those of us who actually went to medical school. These symptoms are textbook manifestations of executive burnout." The casual cruelty of that last statement made Sophie's blood run cold. She had heard variations of it her entire life, the weapon that people with credentials used against those without them. But sometimes credentials blinded you to truth, and sometimes the person with no medical training at all might be the one who saves a life. "I want blood work done," Nathan said, his voice firmer than it had been in days. "If it will put your mind at ease, fine. But I assure you we'll find nothing but elevated stress hormones and perhaps some vitamin deficiencies from your irregular eating habits." Sophie heard the dismissal in Dr. Grady's tone, the same dismissal her mother had faced when she tried to advocate for her own health. The system that was supposed to heal had instead created a hierarchy where being right mattered less than being credentialed. That night after her shift ended, Sophie sat in her small apartment above the resort staff quarters, surrounded by her mother's medical journals. The room was sparse but clean, filled with the kind of practical furniture that came with staff housing. But the bookshelves told a different story. Medical textbooks, nursing journals, volumes of clinical studies that most people would find incomprehensible. She cross-referenced symptoms, compared timelines, built a case that no one would ever let her present. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Nathan Brooks was dying of something entirely preventable. If only someone would listen to the person who had no right to speak. Her mother's nursing bag sat on the desk untouched for 5 years, but carefully maintained. Sophie opened it with reverent hands, finding the stethoscope and blood pressure cuff that had once seemed like magical tools in her mother's competent hands. There was a thermometer pen like basic supplies that represented everything Sophie had walked away from, but tonight they represented possibility. Sometimes the truth comes from the most unexpected places. But what happens when pride is more powerful than proof? The anonymous note appeared on Nathan's nightstand, like a whisper made tangible. "Please test for Lyme disease. Early signs are treatable. Stage 2 can affect your heart and nervous system. Stage 3 can be permanent. Someone who cares." Nathan read it 3 times, his hands shaking not from illness, but from something approaching fear. The handwriting was careful, feminine, the words chosen with precision that spoke of medical knowledge. Whoever had written this knew exactly what they were talking about. But Dr. Grady dismissed it with a laugh that held more contempt than humor. "Anonymous medical advice, Nathan, please. Anyone can look up symptoms on the internet. This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that stress produces. You're letting your imagination run wild. What if they're right? They're not. And even if there was some truth to it, Lyme disease is a rural myth overdiagnosed by country doctors who don't know any better. The chances of you contracting it at a resort of this caliber are essentially 0. But 0 wasn't 0 enough for Nathan. Not anymore. The tremor in his left hand had spread to his arm. The brain fog had thickened until simple decisions felt like navigating through molasses. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a cleaning lady's quiet voice kept repeating. It could be tic-related. Friday morning brought the crisis that changed everything. Sophie found him collapsed in his bathroom, conscious, but unable to move the left side of his face. The confident CEO who had dismissed her concerns 3 days earlier could barely speak his words, slurred by the partial paralysis that had crept across his features like a slow-moving storm. "Help!" he whispered the word, barely recognizable. Sophie didn't hesitate. She called 911, her voice steady and clear as she provided symptoms and timeline to the dispatcher. Then she stayed with him, her small hand gripping his larger one. Her presence the only stability in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. "It's going to be okay," she told him, though her own heart was racing. "This is treatable. We caught it in time." The paramedics arrived with efficiency born of experience, but it was the emergency room doctor who provided the confirmation that split Nathan's world into before and after. Dr. Sarah Chen Young and sharp-eyed took one look at the bullseye rash that was now impossible to ignore and ordered immediate blood tests. "Lyme disease," she announced an hour later, her voice matter-of-fact but kind. "Stage 2 affecting your facial nerves. But you're lucky. If this had progressed to stage 3, we'd be looking at permanent neurological damage." Nathan lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling as the antibiotic drip began its work. Lucky. He was lucky because someone had been paying attention, someone whose concerns he had dismissed without a second thought. The facial paralysis should resolve in a few weeks, Dr. Chen continued. "But I have to ask, how did you know to get tested? Most people don't recognize the early symptoms." Nathan turned his head toward the window where evening light was painting the mountains gold. "Someone tried to tell me. Someone I didn't listen to." Dr. Grady appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. The blood tests didn't lie, and his reputation suddenly felt as fragile as Nathan's health had been just hours before. "Nathan, I get out." Nathan's voice was quiet, but absolute. "Just get out." After Dr. Grady slunk away, Nathan asked the nurse to call the resort. He needed to speak to Sophie Miller. He needed to thank the woman whose voice he had been too proud to hear. But Sophie wasn't answering her phone. When the resort manager finally tracked her down, she was sitting in the staff parking lot, her resignation letter clutched in her hands. "I can't do this anymore," she told her supervisor through tears that had been building for 5 years. "I tried to help someone, and when they finally realized I was right, I felt empty, like it was too little too late." She was climbing into her old Honda when Nathan appeared beside her car, still wearing hospital scrubs and moving carefully but under his own power. The left side of his face remained slightly slack, but his eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them. "Don't go," he said simply. Sophie rolled down her window, wiping tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "You're okay. That's what matters." "No. What matters is that you saved my life and I treated you like you were invisible." Nathan knelt beside her car, bringing himself to her eye level. "I was wrong about everything about you, about what matters, about who deserves to be heard." For the first time since her mother's death, Sophie felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing. The hope that maybe her voice did matter, that maybe her mother's lessons hadn't died with her. "I'm not a doctor," she whispered. "No." Nathan agreed, his lopsided smile somehow more genuine than any expression she had seen from him before. "You're something better. You're someone who cares enough to see what others miss." The moment was unexpectedly heartwarming in its raw honesty. When pride nearly costs everything, can two broken people find a way to heal each other? Recovery, Nathan discovered, was not a straight line, but a winding path that required both humility and help. The antibiotics cleared the infection from his system, but the real healing happened in quieter moments, in conversations that rebuilt his understanding of what intelligence actually meant. Sophie hadn't quit. After all, she had stayed not as his cleaning lady, but as something harder to define. A friend, perhaps, or simply someone who had earned the right to be heard. They met each evening in the resort library, where she shared her mother's medical journals, and he shared his vision for making healthcare technology more accessible to the people who needed it most. "Your mother was brilliant," Nathan said one evening, looking up from a nursing journal filled with careful annotations in the margins. These insights about patient observation, about the importance of listening to subtle changes. This is exactly what we're missing in modern medicine. Sophie traced her finger along her mother's handwriting, remembering late nights when she had been her mother's study partner, learning to see patterns where others saw only symptoms. She always said that technology should amplify human judgment, not replace it. What if it could do both? Nathan leaned forward, the businessman in him, recognizing opportunity. What if we created something that helped doctors listen better, that gave weight to observations from people like you? The idea took shape slowly, like dawn breaking over mountains. Nathan's software company had the technical expertise. Sophie had the clinical insight that came from years of watching and learning and caring. Together, they began designing something unprecedented, a diagnostic tool that democratized medical observation, that gave voice to the voiceless. But first, there were apologies to make. The confrontation with Dr. Grady happened at Nathan's lawyer's office, a sterile conference room, where reputations went to die. The older doctor sat across from them, his silver hair perfectly styled, but his confidence finally cracked. "You nearly killed me," Nathan said without preamble. "Your arrogance, your refusal to consider that someone without your credentials might know something you didn't. It almost cost me my life." Dr. Grady shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Nathan, you have to understand. No, you have to understand." This woman, Nathan gestured to Sophie, who sat quietly beside him, saw what you missed. She knew what you didn't. And you dismissed her because she cleans rooms instead of examining them. The lawsuit that followed made headlines not because of the money involved, but because of the precedent it set. For the first time in medical history, a patient had successfully sued a doctor not for misdiagnosis, but for diagnostic arrogance, for refusing to listen to non-medical observations that proved accurate. The settlement funded something even more important than justice. It funded change. 6 months later, Nathan stood on a stage at the annual Medical Technology Conference, his face fully healed, but marked by something deeper than physical recovery. Beside him, Sophie wore a simple black dress and the kind of quiet confidence that came from being heard. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathan began, his voice carrying to the back of the packed auditorium, "I want to tell you about the day a cleaning lady saved my life." The story unfolded like a masterclass in humility. Nathan spared no detail in describing his arrogance, his dismissal of Sophie's concerns, the near-fatal cost of his pride. The audience of doctors, nurses, and health care executives listened in rapt silence as he delivered this inspirational deconstruction of everything they thought they knew about expertise and authority. "We've created a medical system that values credentials over observation, degrees over intuition, titles over truth." Nathan continued, "And in doing so, we've silenced some of the most important voices in healthcare. The people who spend the most time with patients, who notice the subtle changes, who care enough to pay attention." He turned to Sophie, who stepped forward with the grace of someone who had finally found her voice. "This is Sophie Miller. She's not a doctor, but she sees what doctors miss. She's not a nurse, but she understands what nurses know. She's the person we should have been listening to all along." Sophie's speech was brief but profound. Her words, carrying the weight of every dismissed observation, every ignored concern, every life that might have been saved if someone had simply listened. It was inspirational in its simplicity and power. "I don't need a white coat to care about people," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I don't need a medical degree to notice when something's wrong. What I need, what we all need, is a healthcare system that recognizes wisdom wherever it comes from. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. Can two people who found each other in the darkest moment transform an entire system? 3 years later, the Evergreen Institute for Collaborative Healthcare occupied a sprawling campus in the Connecticut mountains, not far from the resort where it all began. The building's design reflected its mission glass walls instead of closed doors, circular seating instead of hierarchical arrangements, spaces that encouraged conversation between people who might never have spoken in traditional medical settings. Sophie walked through the halls with the measured pace of someone who had learned to trust her own authority. The white coat she wore bore no name tag, no list of degrees, just a simple pin that read Chief Observer, a title Nathan had created, specifically for her role in training healthcare workers to recognize and value non-clinical observations. It had raised eyebrows in the medical community, but the measurable improvements in early diagnosis rates spoke louder than credentials. The Institute's diagnostic app, powered by Sophie's insights and Nathan's technology, had already prevented dozens of cases like Nathan's own. Cleaning staff, teachers, family members, anyone who spent significant time with another person could input observations that the system would analyze for patterns that might indicate serious illness. Medical professionals made the final diagnosis, but now they had access to information they had never considered before. Sophie Nathan appeared at her office door, holding a familiar-looking envelope. The CDC wants to expand the Lyme surveillance program nationwide. They're using our model as the template. She looked up from her desk where patient observation reports were scattered like pieces of a puzzle, only she could solve. 8 years ago, she had left nursing school convinced that she couldn't save anyone. Now she was saving people she would never meet. Lives that hung in the balance between observation and action. My mother would be proud, Sophie said softly. She would be amazed, Nathan corrected. You've built something she couldn't have imagined. Through the window, they could see the first group of the day arriving for the Institute's community education program. Retail workers, hotel staff, teachers, parents, people who had never considered themselves part of the healthcare system, but who were learning to recognize the details that professionals often dismissed were now at the center of attention. Nathan stood beside Sophie at the wide glass window, watching a young instructor guide a group of summer camp staff on how to recognize the telltale signs of tick-borne illness. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up? Nathan asked quietly. Sophie thought back to the frightened girl she had once been, the one who shook as she tried to warn a man too proud to listen. Her voice came slowly but with strength. I think about all the times I stayed silent, the moments I noticed something and convinced myself it wasn't important. But now I know better. Every detail matters, every voice counts. Anyone who cares enough to really see can make the difference. When she turned from the window, Nathan caught a glimpse of someone transformed. Not the timid maid of the past, but a woman who had stepped out from the shadows of her loss with purpose in her eyes. We're not just changing medicine, Sophie told him. We're changing who gets to be part of it. Later that day, they attended the weekly review session, where medical experts and community members came together to work through difficult cases. Sophie observed as an emergency nurse gave way to a janitor's insights about a patient's habits, and as a respected heart specialist, leaned in to hear a daughter's careful description of changes she had noticed at home. The change was powerful to witness. Not loud, not dramatic, but profound. A healthcare culture that valued listening as much as testing. One that believed compassion was as vital as credentials. One that accepted that sometimes the untrained eye could be the one that saw what no one else did. As the sun sank behind the mountain ridge, Sophie and Nathan walked the forest trails where danger had once lurked, and awareness had triumphed. Nathan's health was fully restored, but the man who walked beside her was no longer the same self-assured mogul who once brushed off her concerns. "Thank you," he murmured, words that had become a quiet ritual between them. "For what?" Sophie asked gently, though she already knew. for seeing me when I couldn't see you, for saving my life when my pride wouldn't let me, for showing me that real intelligence isn't just knowledge. It's noticing what others miss. They stopped at a clearing where the foundation of a new building was being laid, a training center for future healthcare workers eager to learn how to listen to unheard voices. The walls had yet to rise, but Sophie knew the true foundation was already set in the hearts and minds that had been changed. She smiled into the evening air, feeling her mother's presence in the wind. Some lessons are only learned through hardship, but those are the ones that shape the world.